first met him when he was an editor of The Economist, which was at that time and still is the most authoritative publication in the world, where if you read anything, you would more or less be fair to say that you got the facts right. Anyway, after that, another illustrious career with both the Telegraph and the Times, and today he's still chairman of the Times newspaper. So he's got an incredible amount of knowledge and experience about how the world has moved on in the last 20 or 30 years from being essentially a world in which cyberspace did not exist to one today where the internet and cyberspace impinge on our lives to such a fast and dramatic extent that we don't really know, those of us who cross both generations, what is going to happen. And I hope today that Andrew is going to tell us, dispense a few pearls of wisdom. And I'd like to encourage you to ask him questions as well. So I'm just going to hand over to Andrew to say whatever he wants to say, and then I'm going to ask him a couple of questions to start the Q&A, and then afterwards I hope that you will pick his brain as well, because this is a golden moment for you to become cleverer and better informed and learn a few things, okay? So before that, however, I want you to join me in thanking Andrew for coming to China Exchange this morning.
Well, there are two enormous elements of relief in what's just happened. The first is, thank heavens, there are so few people. It's less intimidating when I think of some of the audiences that David is able to compete with. It's extraordinary range of real friendships. I suppose you've heard this said before, he is just the most generous person I've ever known. The second thing is that he's just given my talk, so I don't have to say anything. I became editor of The Economist. I'll just give you a brief thing, which you probably know already. In 1974, which was a very uncertain and very different time in British history and in global history. I mean, who knew about China much in 1974? Who knew how desperate life was in the United Kingdom, politically and in the political economy? Those were just such different times. So, as David said, there is running a chart, a huge element of change just in the political economy, in the global economy, thinking of politics, thinking of China, obviously, but also the changing, diminishing power of the United States and the lack of coherence in Europe. All these things have been big changes. And I was at The Economist editing it for, I mean, I was there, worked there for 20 years, but in the Washington office during a particularly resonant and difficult election, which I should think, looking around the room, very few people in the room remember at all vividly. I do. This was in 1968. In 1968, there was an election where there were riots over Vietnam in the streets of virtually every major American city anybody over here has heard of, where Martin Luther King was assassinated within a week or two of my arriving in America, and where Bobby Kennedy, whom I got to know quite well, was assassinated 10 or 15 minutes after I'd been talking to him on the telephone. It was an extraordinary thing for young journalists at the time to be involved in that. I remember being on an aeroplane, this was before I became editor, with Robert Kennedy, sitting next to him, and I always remember that he had his sleeves rolled up, and he was one of those men, I wish I was one actually, who had really masculine, hairy arms. So all his forearm here was, I remember this vividly because I was sitting next to him, and staggering onto the plane was a member of the now dead, of the Sunday Times Inside team from the UK, called David Leach. David Leach staggered onto the plane. I'd known him in various reporting situations. He reported many a war. And I said, well, David, what on earth brings you here? He said, I've come here to see when this chap, sitting next to me, is shot. And I just remember, the reason I remember Robert's arms was because all I could do was just look down like that. He took it brilliantly, and of course a few weeks later he was shot. So these are times when most of you in the room simply don't remember when America was in major crisis, when China didn't as a world factor exist. Russia very much did, and yet it is now a diminishing and defensively aggressive power. So it was an extraordinary time, and then I was brought over to Brussels, or to London and then to Brussels, to report British entry into the common market, as it was then known, now the European Union. And of course that was a big and formative time, which we see is still being played out in the UK and in Europe because of the lack of coherence in Europe, which I have some views, if you want to ask me, in terms of the euro and its role. So then I've always thought that my time as The Economist must have been, is this all right? Must have been, nobody else could have edited The Economist at a time so intensely interesting as I was. What I just described, the Kissinger years of foreign policy making in America, Kissinger/Nixon years of foreign policy making in America, the Russian involvement in Afghanistan, which has led to all the things that have subsequently happened, the change in India after the Gandhi dynasty, the emergence above all of China, the complete change in how you view economic policy in terms of when I became editor in 1974, nobody, but almost nobody, questioned Keynesianism, as it's called, which I won't obviously try and give a dissertation on, but where effectively you manage the economy when there was a recession, you pumped money into the economy, and when there was, as a government, and when there was a boom, you took money out of the economy, tried to regulate it without any recourse to interest rates or to monetary policy. All that changed when Milton Friedman wrote the books that he wrote, and papers that he wrote, and not just him, obviously, but led by him, and that Margaret Thatcher, Keith Joseph, and eventually Reagan adopted it. The whole basis for economic policy in free societies changed. So how interesting was that as a period? Because then there was the beginning, we were in the height of the Cold War. I went to Moscow several times during that time. The only resentment I really got was that I knew Dick Helms, the head of the CIA in Washington, and I went to Russia and I knew some of their chief spies, and nobody tried to recruit me, and I felt really bad about that. It was a sort of lack of status, really, because there I was, anonymous, because The Economist is an anonymous newspaper.
So you're too honest.
So there was, we have this extraordinary Cold War period, which was at its most intense between Russia and the West, led by America. We had the dawning of China, which I know very little about, but I'll just tell you one little anecdote in a minute. And the change of economic policy, the complete change in the UK of the power of the unions post-war setup, the abandonment of Keynesianism, the resort to monetarism, which was finally completed actually by Gordon Brown and Tony Blair when they put the setting of interest rates into the hands of the Bank of England, which of course had been the case with the Federal Reserve in America for a long time. These changes were monumental, and I thought nobody could possibly ever edit The Economist at such an interesting time. How wrong I was. Oh, would I love to be in my mid-30s now editing The Economist. Just look at the world that we face now. It is even more dangerously interesting, even more expensive and encouraging in some ways, and even more risky and horrifying in others. As I look at the debt situation, which is so far we are solving, in my view, we're trying to solve the debt drug problem that we have by issuing yet more debt at every level. The IMF actually said yesterday that China was joining that club and was resorting to too much debt to finance it, to keep the growth rate up. So even China, which has fantastic reserves, mostly in US dollars, is being accused by the IMF, or the International Monetary Fund, of resorting to debt. Just look at how the whole nature of the Middle Eastern problem, which has always been high on America's and Europe's agenda, how that has changed now not from a state problem or even a Palestinian problem, although that's obviously at the bottom of it, but to a terrorism problem. And terrorism, of course, it's only a matter of time before the terrorist is able to have drones of his own. It's only a matter of time before the terrorist is able to use chemical and nuclear weapons in some form or another, delivered probably in a suitcase or whatever. So we are in an unbelievably, talking totally coldly, journalistically, interesting time, which has dramatically changed from my time at The Economist, when I thought, and I've always thought until relatively recently, that I was in the lovely position of editing The Economist at a time when things could not have been more interesting, worrying, yet encouraging, and debating. That has been, I've been proving that I would love to be the editor of The Economist today. As Annie mentioned, Better is the first woman to edit The Economist, took over a month or two ago. She has some of the most interesting years that you could possibly imagine. There's a sort of, I have an informal rule that in newspapers no editor should edit a newspaper for more than 10 to 12 years. Because I don't know how many of you know this, those of you who come from Asia know this expression of young Turks. We talk about young Turks. You know what I mean by that? It's a sort of, I don't know where it actually comes from, where the young Turks, but the idea is that young Turks are the ones who come in with great revolutionary ideas and do things. The difficulty about young Turks is that they become old Turks after 8, 10 or 12 years. They bring in their own people, and that certainly goes for running newspapers, and why I think English newspapers are so much more vibrant than many newspapers in the world is because they've basically been run by young people. So I thought it was time to get out from The Economist when I'd been there 9 years, and I eventually left after 11. But I told the powers that be, including even to Rothschild, who was one of your previous leaders, who was my chairman, great chairman, that I ought to leave sometime soon, and I did about 18 months later, because, and this is where the newspaper revolution comes in, which we can talk about. The first newspaper revolution, is we're now in the middle of the second one. The first newspaper revolution, I was recruited by a man who later went to jail called Conrad Black, because he had, organised by me actually, had bought himself control of the Daily Telegraph, which is our largest broadsheet paper in this country, which was bankrupt at the time, not formally declared bankrupt. And we were very lucky, we managed to ride on the coattails of our main competitor, Mr. Rupert Murdoch, in confronting the unions, who I don't quite know how to describe this. I think there's no trade unionists involved, trade unionists in the ground, but it was basically a protection racket. Trade unions were effectively running the newspapers and running the economics of the newspapers to their own benefit. Just to give you an example, the Telegraph we made into a very profitable and growing paper. It lost circulation, lost advertising, it grew its circulation, it grew advertising. This is before the web came along, remember. When I joined the Daily Telegraph as chief executive, I was recruited out of the Economist. We employed just under 7,000 people. We produced a paper which was never more than 48 pages and was all in black and white. When I left 4 or 5 years later, we were producing 120-page papers, all full color, i.e., you know what I mean, not black and white, but with color available on every page. Our circulation was higher than it had been, and we were employing 1,200 people, 1,200 people. The trades unions resisted, completely understandably, from their own point of view. They resisted any kind of new technology. Just using simple, if you imagine in 1986 how primitive new technology was compared with now, but it was different. I mean, I've given my iPhone 6, actually, it's over there. If I produce my iPhone 6 now, that has as much capacity as an IBM computer filling half this room in 1986, literally. So there's been a huge, huge change since 1986, but even in 1986, with new technology, then thought of as new technology, you could run a newspaper with far more words in it, same number of journalists, 4 color on every page, which is a very complex change in printing, 120 pages instead of 148, with 1,200 people instead of 6,700. That is a measure of the absurdity that our newspaper industry had got to at the time. And it was a revolution. It made all the newspapers extremely profitable overnight. They had to spend an awful lot of money to lay off the printers because they were quite generous in doing so, except Rupert Murdoch, who effectively they struck, and so he didn't have to be as generous to them. Whereas the rest of us effectively paid off our printers, took on an enormous debt, but paid it off very quickly, with huge profitability. That meant that all the newspapers then went to sleep. They were so profitable, they were doing so well, that they never really thought about the coming revolution. And the coming revolution is the second revolution, which we're in the middle of now, which is why read a newspaper when you can get it on the screen, on your iPhone or whatever? Why read it when you can pick and choose your news sources all over the web? And the answer is, I think, that whereas we have 10 national newspapers in this country now, we'll come down to 3 or 4 sometime. I don't know when, and I don't know who the survivors will be. I think the Times will be one of them, but I would say that would and who will survive among the Mail and the Sun and the Mirror, which are our big tabloid popular papers for those of you who are not particularly interested in reading. So we're now in the middle of that second revolution. So that at the Telegraph, I was there at a time of unbelievable personal risk, not just to me, but to several people. We all had bodyguards. Mine was my chauffeur, who was an ex-heavyweight boxer who went everywhere. It was an extremely worrying and dangerous time. And I was far from the main target, I can tell you. I don't say that to glory me, but I can think of half a dozen people who were in far more risk than I was. It was a very, very unpleasant time. So then I left Conrad Black because he came to work in London, and he was a very good proprietor, I thought. However, he was somebody who was quite interested in feathering his own nest financially. It was a relationship which began to deteriorate when I left. much to his fury, and I was portrayed in his newspapers in a very unsavory light, but considering I'd made him so rich, I was not very happy about it. But anyway, and then the following year, Mr. Murdoch hired me because I made such difficulty for him because one of our papers, the Saturday Telegraph, had begun to undermine his Sunday Times. That was not a success, in that we're very different people. He's one of the most brilliant, clear-headed, splendid, and personally generous men I've ever come across. I say that because it's deeply unfashionable to say it, because he's loathed in this country by many people. We simply had different management styles, although he led to my considerable surprise when we agreed to part, which was on my initiative, but nevertheless I'm sure he was very relieved. When we agreed to part, he asked me to stay on the board, where I was for a long time until we got into the whole phone hacking business and all that stuff, where I stayed on to see that through, not that I was running the show. And I'm now off that board, although I'm still, he asked me then to chair the Times and the Sunday Times, which we've been through. So I've seen an awful lot, both in the newspaper industry, which we can talk about, and in the world. I know very little, just with a deep, deep apology, about China. I've been there several times. It's been absolutely enthralling. But I have a single anecdote which told me more about China than almost anything else I have read, which was in 1979, because I was then, so to speak, the bright young editor of The Economist. I was invited to China as a sort of, not as a top-level Western celeb, but probably rank 2 or 3 or whatever it was, because the Cultural Revolution had ended not long previously, and I was invited as a guest. And I went with my then wife, Sabiha, who interestingly thought, oh, this is going to be wonderful, because Andrew, that's me, would witness Asia, and I, Sabiha, am Asian, but she's from India, an extraordinary woman. And in fact, when we got there, we discovered the Chinese couldn't care less about India. They didn't regard themselves as fellow Asians at all. I mean, and so she was wrong in that particular respect. We didn't have any special entry because of her. And I think we were both very, very taken aback and surprised by that. However, we were obviously, I interviewed a lot of people, never got to see Tang, nor did I expect to or ask to. But he was in his major ascendancy then. Deng Xiaoping had seen through so many difficult times personally and musically. And there he was, emerging, trying to bring in, which one has to question, bring in capitalist and free enterprise ways of working in a society which is not politically, in my view, really geared to working that out over a long period of time. There will have to be some kind of, I would have thought Dave knows so much more than me, and so would most of you, so I won't go any further with that. But on the capitalist thing, it was wonderful. Sabiha and I were in a car going to visit, which had recently been unearthed, the extraordinary soldiers outside Xi'an, which they call it
terracotta.
The terracotta army. So we were going to go and see the terracotta army, and that is 15, 20 miles or so, or maybe more or less, outside Xi'an. Did I pronounce that correctly? Xi'an. So we stayed overnight in Xi'an, and we were put in a car, and the roads were very poor, so it took quite a long time, amazingly, wouldn't now, I'm sure, to get there. And as we were going there, we went through a town where there was a huge amount of people. It was a great hubbub. And Feng Shui, a wonderful lady from the Foreign Office in Beijing, I said, oh, Feng Shui, could we actually just stop and look and see what's happening? And she was a bit flustered. She thought, well, no, this isn't authorized, it hasn't been arranged, and so on and so forth. So we went on to the terracotta army, because she said, no, I'm sorry, Mr. Knight, we're going to be lazy, and so on. On the way back, she said, oh, well, I've actually arranged that we can stop in this town on the way back. So we stopped in the town, and there was an enormous hubbub, and I always remember this. I went through a great, there was a huge circular earthworks, I should think 20, 30 feet high, enormous parapet made of earth, with an entrance in it. And I went through the entrance, and inside, this is just after the Cultural Revolution, when total communist, effectively socialist state, when nobody owned their own land or nothing, there was the biggest street market of selling pigs, selling this, selling that, chickens all held up by pieces of string. The most amazing free market economic thing going on. I was thrilled by this. I thought, gosh, China's really good, you know. This is where China is going to be eventually. The most amazing moment was I got back in the car, and she was looking metaphorically as white as a sheet. She said, Mr. Knight, what were they doing? This foreign office civil servant had no idea what a market was. She'd never seen one before. She literally was, and I explained very slowly, I said, well, you see, the people there, the ones who bought chickens, are selling those or trading them, and they are buying bread or what is that? And it was like, this is a highly intelligent woman, it was like taking her to school about the way, and that was the most significant. I've had many interviews with Chinese bankers and others here over the years. I have had several, 2 or 3 visits, I mustn't say, to China. I've met many, many Chinese. I know all the people like Kissinger and Winston Lord, all those famous China hands from, you know, I've had so many conversations as a distant non-expert about China. That was the thing that showed me where China was going. When she had to be told what was happening, where hundreds of people were trading. So that's my only, I'm afraid, relevant to China incident.
Yes, you have. I mean, and thank you. I mean, on that incident, I suppose what it said, what it exemplified was the fact that that capitalism was very fast in being developed. As you rightly said, the Cultural Revolution more or less fizzled out in 1976. So if you were in China in 1979, that would be soon afterwards. And Tang actually, I remember very clearly, declared formally the economic zone in Shenzhen, which was, of course, the summit, the critical point at which his open policy emerged, was 2 years, 3 months, and 4 days, 2, 3, 4, after the death of Mao. And so you were witnessing the very nascent explosion of free market economy in China, and probably hidden, and not surprisingly, because people still didn't know whether it was acceptable or whether it was permissible to have all those free market dealings. And your lady, the ignorant guy, obviously was on the other side of the government, having heard about it, but not really witnessing. So you touch on precisely that sensitive moment when people were actually saying, well, I think it's all right for us to make a profit, but let's just see. And then the government say, well, Deng Xiaoping said it's okay, but I mean, have we seen anything? And so forth. So this hesitancy exemplified very well what you saw. And of course, now you see there's been an explosion of capitalism, and it's gone further. The role of the civil servant is precisely the opposite, that he knows too well what was going on, and has himself or herself become corrupt. So it's gone full circle the other way. But thank you for charting that extremely interesting history of your life, which also reflect on enormous changes over the years. I just want to start asking you two questions. We talk about broadsheet and the tabloid here in Britain and elsewhere, I suppose, but much more consciously in Britain. What is the difference now, if there is one?
What is the difference between the crude popular press, which is what we call tabloids, just for those of you who know, and between them on the one hand and the broadsheets on the other, which are papers like the Financial Times, the Guardian, those now not quite fully broad, in physical, the Telegraph, and finally the Times, which went tabloid in shape, but still classes itself. The answer is it's diminished. And of course, I haven't talked about the Mail, which bridges the two.
Because the question I'm now going to ask is that difference, or the differences between the two, must be even more blurred given the internet, because you wouldn't consciously say, I'm going to read a broadsheet, or I'm going to read a tabloid. You would simply look up the internet. I mean, the Mail is very interesting. You say it saddles both sides. I mean, it has the most extraordinarily successful website in the world. 250 million readers a month. I was with Jonathan Rothermere on Monday.
He's the owner, by the way.
Yes, he's the owner of the Mail, and he was bragging to me that it's going to go even higher up, and the only thing is that he needs to monetize it a bit. The problem with the Mail online, which I must say I'm a bit addicted to it. I don't know whether you are addicted to it. Anybody who starts reading the Mail online becomes immediate. Are you addicted to it? No. But you can become addicted to it. I'm one of the 250 million people. They can't monetize it because it's too broad. So advertisers don't want to just advertise to 250 million people. But what he has done now, he was explaining, was that I hope he will come and give a talk one day. Although he's trying to keep very low profile because of the Dom issue. But the point is that they're now starting to get advertisers on special things. So if you press a button on Taylor Swift or current anything, you get an advert from Burberry, because Burberry is thinking those people who want to read more about fashion, they will go in. So it's beginning to monetize. Anyway, that's not the point. But presumably nowadays, people are not going to bother about. I mean, I have never now seen one single person under the age of 30 with a newspaper in their hands. I don't think any of you. Was any of you reading the newspaper? I mean, you were quite young. How old are you?
27.
So how come you are still reading the newspaper? Why didn't you go online?
If I'm online, I get distracted, and I just click through things. If I've got paper in front of me, I actually sit there and read it and ingest it more, I think. And I get it free at Waitrose as well.
This is very, very interesting, because you are in a minority in the newspaper reading educated middle and upper classes. Definitely what David says is right in its aggregate, but there are still lots of you. Actually, this really comes to a really interesting thing that you've raised, David. David says that talking to Lord Rothermere, whose family, they're not the total owners of Mail, but they control it with enough shares. And it's a long-standing family which we talk about for a long time. They've been involved in British newspapers and politics for 100 more years. He has built this, or they built this extraordinary website, and on the web, and among the broadsheet papers, The Guardian has done that mostly. The Guardian is now widely available on the web and is read by, I think, 1 million or 2 people on the scale at the moment, primarily in the United States, but also here. However, the big word that David used a moment ago was monetization. Has it been monetized? And the answer is no, it hasn't. Why has it not been monetized? The Mail is a special creature. I don't read it online, so I don't really know. But its content is very widely, far, far wider and far more celeb-driven than I gather the paper itself.
Read it to that result.
But I'm sure it's got a lot of stuff in it. But I mean, if you take its totality, it's got an awful lot of content which would not be in the Mail. The Guardian's content is very seriously Guardian, plus developments from it, mostly current affairs, and they have built up the wide audience. What both of them so far, and I don't think this will go on, I think they will succeed, but what they have distinguished themselves from the rest of the newspaper industry, which I'll come to in a minute, by giving free content on the web. 2 things happen if you give free content on the web. First of all, there's no incentive to read the Guardian newspaper in print, because you can get it all on the web. So therefore, why would you pay 30 or 40p a day to buy it when you can get it free on the web? So therefore, that's anti-monetization. It's actually diminished, I was going to say destroyed, seriously diminished their circulation revenue. And their circulation is plummeting. But the second thing, which I think was a real miscalculation, which David actually referred to, which is that advertisers didn't follow that into the web for 2 reasons. First of all, because it's not targeted enough, and that's what you were talking about. How can you target it to the result level? And secondly, the price of advertising, because supply is infinite on the web, because you can get as much advertising, you can buy advertising is so prevalent on the web, across the web, which is vast. The price has plummeted too. So that all the calculations in the Guardian and Mail business models were going on the web with free content were grossly undermined by the fact that the price of advertising on the web fell. So none of their numbers came true. They are now working on that.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. They're not monetized, whereas, if you want to read the Times, you have to bind it. But I just want to put 2 thoughts in your mind about your 2 points, as a devil's advocate. The point about giving away free at the moment. In the case of Mail, we've seen huge evidence that people get hooked. So I'm thinking that the Mail becomes the drug peddler. He actually wants to give you free drugs at the beginning, but he knows that you will be hooked. Now, if tomorrow we are asked to pay £10 or £20 or whatever it is that is equivalent to the Times of getting subscribed, those of us who are hooked, of whom there are 250 million, I would say, roughly, I'm putting a wild guess, if 10% or 5% were to subscribe, that's a lot of money. So perhaps they might be more devious than we think, and that they're holding their breath under the water, and in 2 or 3 years' time they're going to say, right, no more free, you can't get access, you're now hooked, buy your drugs, pay your £5 a month or £10 a month to get it. And the other point about advertising is also, I know, and it was confirmed by Roland, that they're now trying to cut out the middleman, the advertising agency. They are now challenging Martin Sorrell of WPP, who was one of my previous guests, because they are saying you don't need to go to him. You come to us direct, and we'll give you a rate, so that they actually can offer even cheaper rates because it goes directly to them and they come up the middle. So all these things are happening, and it's fascinating. We don't know. I don't know what's happening. I mean, these are just speculations, and they are interesting.
No, I think you're completely right. I mean, I think I did actually say, I think it will come right, and that point to make reasons it will come right. And there's an extremely good exemplar of that, which is Facebook. I was on the board of News Corp when we unanimously and with enthusiasm, I certainly was very enthusiastic about it, bought something called MySpace for 500-something million dollars. And it was the market leader at the time. Facebook was doing roughly the same thing, I mean very roughly the same thing, for a student, basically for a student population at Harvard and so on. We all seen the movie, we read an awful lot about it and so on and so forth. Facebook just went on with venture capitalists behind it, eventually. Went on providing it free and not cluttering it up with advertising. And of course, MySpace was wiped out. And I think it was eventually sold at $560 million worth of investment, plus a lot of money then put in trying to develop it, was sold for I think $20 or $30 million finally to get it off the books. I can remember the first moment that I actually realized that and I was shouted down in the board because I kept on raising it, because I had very slender evidence that this was happening at the time. Every time I said, look, Facebook's doing this, Facebook's doing that. That was entirely because two stepchildren of mine, Rita's son and daughter, older son and daughter, my wife's son and daughter, they were all saying, oh my God, MySpace is so damn difficult to use. It's absolutely impossible. It keeps on cluttering us up with advertising. We like Facebook. So I would go into these board meetings with this very, very substantial piece of evidence. Look, my two stepchildren say that Facebook is winning every single time. And of course they were completely right. And it did. I was shouted down because the numbers of MySpace at the time, and this is an absolute example of yours. Facebook, their strategy was do it free until we've hooked everybody, and then we'll get a little bit of money.
I mean, it is important to ask.
And it will come. I'll just say one more thing, though, on the newspapers. You're completely right. That is what will happen, I think. The alternative model is the one that the Times, the Wall Street Journal, and the Financial Times are doing, which is charging right from the start, saying we won't have massive numbers. But if you take the Times newspaper, this may prove short-term, because of what you said, I honestly don't know, and I hope not. The Times newspaper has lost between 30 and 60 million pounds in today's money, plus a huge amount of investment, ever since Murdoch bought it, which was in 1982. He must have put the best part of £1 billion into keeping the Times newspaper going, simply because he loves newspapers. Last year, we made a profit of a magnificent profit of £1.2 million. Fantastic. Not exactly major, but huge in terms of the Times. How on earth did that happen? That, and this year, I don't want to be too precise, but we will make a little bit more than that, but tiny amounts. But nevertheless, we are cash and profit, cash positive at the moment, for the first time in living memory, because our predecessors, a lot of Murdoch's predecessors at the Times all lost money as well. Nobody ever made money out of the Times. Now,
we
why
need
is
to know
it?
the secret, yes.
No. The answer is because they started saying you can have it on the web. By the way, it's, if I had my iPad, which is over there now, if I can show it to you. It's an unbelievably succulent, beautiful product. You get the newspaper on your iPad. And
yes, I do. I go on it.
And there you are, he's hooked as well. But
you are the second one I look at. That is on my thing.
So, but it comes up as the newspaper on the iPad, and we sell that. And we sell it for actually quite very little, but nevertheless we sell it so that I, for example, can have a subscription to the Times and I get it on the iPad as well, or I can buy it on the iPad and not paper. Funnily enough, that model has actually turned us into profit. But it's not going to be major profit at any time of the kind that I suspect Rothermere and the Mail will eventually make. It's a minor thing. It also has one downside. My daughter, her son, is in the audience. Her older sister, India Knight, is a very, very well-known journalist in this country. She, and she's not alone, have complained vigorously to me the fact that they are read by fewer people than their competitors on the Mail and Guardian. So the writers find it difficult.
They have now completely changed. I mean, I've been following the Times. I read the Times. I gave it up because it suddenly became a bit too too frivolous at some stage. And also, they changed all the compilers for the crossword. And the crossword really went down. And so I had to go back to Tang. But now I go back to the Times because they have now changed the website. They look very much like the Daily Mail. I promise you. Why? There are more colours than print. Right? And this is 50-50 now. It used to be 10%, but now it's 50-50. It's creeping up to 60, whereas Daily Mail is about 80 or 90. And the fact of the matter is, the world today, we have such short concentration. People now, young people, I mean, I ask my children all about the internet and so forth, and they are all usually right. What interests me, the only other thing I want to ask you before I want to ask you to ask you questions is, you see, Huffington Post started off with a premise, and it was sold for a lot of money, that you don't need writers anymore, and that the only thing people care about are their own peers, because looking at the younger generation, they don't want to know somebody else to tell them what to wear. They know what to wear by talking to their friends, and they go and collate, what they do, and they only talk to their friends. So this Huffington Post so-called press revolution to say you can cut out all the expert writers. We don't need India Knight, we don't need David Tang, we don't need Matthew Paris and so forth. We only need to know what everybody's writing. But of course today, Huffington Post is completely driven by expert writers rather than unknown people. And therefore, if you go on the Mail and you look down at comments, you suddenly realize that you can't read all of them because there are about 1,000. You don't know who they are. It's like a TripAdvisor. I never read TripAdvisor because I don't know who they are. For all I know, they could be planted, by their competitors, and they usually are. So what I'm saying is this: is that you can change, you can think about the way you can change about what people read, but ultimately, everything remains the same. It's just a newspaper edited in the same way, but in a different form.
I'd only say that if you're going to learn from a point of ignorance like me about what's happening in China at the moment, where do I turn? If I go on to the Huffington Post, if I don't know who it is, and I suppose that's the value of a brand like, say, the Financial Times, or indeed on a good day at the Times. In fact, there are many good days at the Times. You go where you feel, oh, well, I know they're likely to have a reliable person. It's the secret of The Economist. I mean, if you think of The Economist now, when I became editor, we sold 28,000 copies in the United States, and when I left, we sold 150,000 copies in the United States. The Economist now sells 800,000 in the United States.
Copies?
Copies, actual copies, yes. Plus, they're very good with the website, I would say that, but I do think it's very good. So you have to ask the question, why? And The Economist doesn't even have any bylines. Every single article in The Economist is not signed. It's completely anonymous. Why do you go to The Economist? Those 800,000 people, admittedly, it's not 200-something million. But why do you go to The Economist? You go because you basically are going to get a reliability and a view of the world, which you won't necessarily agree with, but it is a view. You can aim on for it or accept it, whichever you decide. So I do think that these brands, if they play it well over time and actually concentrate on quality, will survive, a few of them, not 10 newspapers, but I don't know, I'm just guessing 3, 4, or whatever. They will survive simply because they are a brand, like when you buy, I know nothing about fashion, but you buy a Gucci thing, you know it's going to be well made. You assume it's going to be Brexit, I don't know. But, you know.
Our brands are bad. Aqua's good.
Well, exactly. It depends on whether the quality is good enough or not. So I think some newspapers will survive, but will they be the major force that they were at one time? Obviously not.
Question? Yes. 1, 2. Ladies first.
Thank you so much. It was hugely informative, really interesting. I don't know how to sort of filter my own questions because I have many, but I'm going to, if I may ask two. So one is, so which model do you think will ultimately prevail in terms of serious publication? So is it going to be an advertising-driven model, bear in mind that Guardian doesn't make any money and that a lot of consumers simply turn on ad blockers so they don't even see the advertising, essentially depriving the publishers? Or is it going to be a subscription model? Again, bear in mind that publications such as The Economist or Financial Times who use this timed subscription model where you can kind of access 5 or 10 articles a month for free. These people don't even get to the wall, so they're not really interested in subscription. I mean, is ultimately the solution for someone like India Knight when she's tweeting her article that I can go, if I want to read her article, should I be paying for that one article? And my second question is, what would you recommend to an aspiring journalist in terms of building a relationship with editors of serious publications? I am one, yes. Well, I've been published by the New Statesman a few times, but nowhere else, I'm saying.
I've got answers to both those questions. I might come to remind me so I don't forget. Which model is going to... I wish I knew the answer because I make a lot of money. But my guess is as follows, that I think that there is a divide between the popular broad newspapers where advertising is going to be the answer at the end of the day, plus hooking people, as David suggested, with a very small subscription. But if you look at Bloomberg, which is effectively now a sort of newspaper on information and analysis, the Financial Times, the Wall Street Journal, I hope the Times and Sunday Times, the New York Times, and their equivalents elsewhere, they will be by subscription, in my view, primarily. My model is a tiny one, which is The Economist, actually, which is that the outstanding chairman of The Economist, now my successor as editor, he has absolutely concentrated the whole ethos of the place on content rather than advertising. He saw that he and his management team saw that advertising was declining. Because The Economist classic advertising was display, what's called display advertising. Most newspapers have suffered primarily not just from display but from classified advertising, because you can buy your house or get a job or do anything on the web. Why would you put a little thing this big? That's classified. But display advertising, which in the case of The Economist and the upmarket papers was hotels and airlines and financial banks and investment banks and so on and so forth. Glossy, big advertisements. they saw very early on that that was the plan. What we've got to do is charge for our content, both online and in print. And it's really, really worked for them, and they are profitable. And really quite profitable for a relatively small unit. I think, personally, that for anything which breeds quality in the brand, real quality, The Economist is just a logo, there isn't a single name attached to it. Anything that breeds quality in the brand should be able to charge for its content. An example at the popular end of that would be, it's now obviously got massive competition, would be Sky Television. I mean, Sky, when it started, was losing, I remember as I was signing the checks at the time, it was losing £3 million, which in 1990 was one hell of a lot of money, excuse my language. But they were losing £3 million for a company whose balance sheet was already overborrowed, namely News Corporation. Look at it now, churning out huge profits, £500 million or more a year. Entirely built, well, they do have advertising, but the advertising is a minor stream. It's basically a subscription, because not only did they buy up sports rights, but they completely transformed the quality, I really mean this, because I'm a sports watcher, the quality of the sports broadcasting was revolutionizing on Sky.